All right, so, wow, things have been pretty crazy in the world of global trade lately. Like right after midnight on April 9th, 2025, those Trump tariffs, the ones we've all been hearing about, well, they actually went into effect. And what happened next? I mean, it felt like watching a trade war unfold in fast forward, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, by April 2nd, just to give you a sense of the timeline, the U.S. had already imposed something like 54% in total tariffs on goods coming in from China. And of course, China didn't just sit back and watch.
No, not at all.
On April 4th, they retaliated with their own tariffs, hit back with 34% on American imports. It was a direct response, tit for tat, really.
It was just the beginning, though, right? That's where things get, well, really interesting. President Trump, he decided to up the ante quite a bit, push those tariffs on China to a pretty staggering 104%. And this all happened on the night of April 9th. And China, they didn't hesitate. They immediately fired back with an 82% tariff, specifically targeting U.S. agricultural products. Ouch.
Yeah, that was a big one. And it didn't stop there either. The same evening, April 9th, President Trump raised the tariffs again. This time, it was all the way up to 125% on those Chinese exports. All this back and forth, I mean, it really felt like the opening shots of a full-blown trade war between, the two biggest economies in the world.
So what happened? I mean, after all that aggressive action, suddenly everything just stopped.
Yeah.
Why? What slammed the brakes on so abruptly?
That's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to try to figure out why those tariffs were suddenly paused, who or what was behind that decision, and what it all means, for the U.S., for the global economy, especially with all this talk about, entering Cold War 2.0 with China. Big stuff.
Exactly. And to really understand the sudden shift, we need to look at all the pressure points, the things that were happening behind the scenes. Our sources point to a few key factors, and it's pretty fascinating to start with the bond market. People often underestimate just how much influence it has, right? The bond market. So the U.S. 10-year Treasury yield, the one that basically sets the standard for borrowing costs all over the place, well, it was climbing pretty rapidly, got close to 4.5%. I know for a lot of people that might just sound like another financial statistic, but this was a big deal. So why was that particular number so important?
Well, what's really interesting here is the role that Japanese hedge funds reportedly played. Apparently, some of these funds were using a lot of leverage. Like, we're talking 60-to-1 leverage. That means for every dollar they had, they were controlling $60 worth of U.S. Treasury bonds.
Wow, that's a lot of leverage.
Yeah, and that kind of leverage, it magnifies everything. You can make a lot of money really quickly, but you can also lose a lot really quickly. So when these funds saw the market moving against them, they started selling off those bonds, and all that selling, it pushed that 10-year yield up fast.
And then there was that 5% threshold. Everyone seemed to be really worried about that number.
Yeah.
What was it about hitting 5% that was so scary? Like, what kind of catastrophic effect could that have had?
Well, if that 10-year year it had hit 5%, American borrowing costs would have gone through the roof. Think about it. Mortgage rates, the interest rates on loans for businesses, even the cost of paying back the national debt, everything would have gotten a lot more expensive. And that would have been a huge drag on the economy. It could have even triggered a downturn in the financial markets. It's like a tipping point. Once you cross it, things can spiral pretty quickly.
So the bond market was basically waving a big red flag saying, hey, this isn't good.
Right.
And it's interesting, initially the administration, they kind of downplayed the bond market's influence. Treasury Secretary Besson, I think, said it wasn't a major factor in the decision to pause the tariffs.
Yeah, there was definitely some downplaying at first, but then President Trump himself, he actually came out and said that he was, in fact, watching the bond market very closely when he made that decision to hit pause. I mean, that tells you something right there. The bond market was applying some serious pressure.
So it wasn't just the bond market that was worried. It seems like some pretty big names on Wall Street were getting nervous, too.
Oh, absolutely. It seems like Wall Street was, well, let's just say they were nudging President Trump toward a less aggressive approach. And one voice that really stood out was Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan. He gave an interview on CNBC TV 18, and, people pay attention when Jamie Dimon speaks.
Yeah, he doesn't mince words. And he had some pretty strong opinions about those tariffs, didn't he? He famously said, markets aren't always right, but sometimes they are right. Sounds like he thought this was one of those times. So what was the core of his warning? What was he most concerned about?
His biggest concern was the uncertainty that these tariffs were creating, not just for the overall economy, but for individual companies as well. He talked about how this uncertainty could lead to pricing instability and how that could really hurt consumer confidence, which, is a big driver of the economy. Basically, he's saying, look, Things are already kind of fragile, and if we keep escalating this trade war, it's going to make things a whole lot worse.
And he offered some pretty direct advice too, right? He said, take a deep breath, negotiate some trade deals. He even pointed out that there were something like 70 countries out there who were ready and willing to talk. Sounds like he was advocating for, well, a more diplomatic approach.
Yeah, exactly. He was saying, let's focus on making deals, not starting wars. But it's worth noting that not everyone in the administration agreed with him. Peter Navarro, for example, and Commerce Secretary Lutnick, they were pushing for a much tougher line. They weren't even interested in zero tariff proposals. They wanted those non-trade barriers removed, which, is a whole other can of worms.
Right, those non-trade barriers, things like regulations and standards, intellectual property rules, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's not something you just fix overnight. It takes time, a lot of negotiation.
Exactly. Very complex stuff.
So you've got the bond market freaking out, you've got Wall Street sounding the alarm bells, and then you've got Silicon Valley. Those tech giants, they were starting to get pretty vocal about their concerns too.
Oh yeah, Silicon Valley, they're a huge part of this story. Their whole business model is built on these global supply chains, especially in China and Southeast Asia. It's all so interconnected, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, you can't really talk about those big tech companies without acknowledging how much they rely on those regions. Can you give us some concrete examples just to illustrate how dependent they are?
Sure. So take Apple, for instance. They manufacture, get this, 50% of their iPhones in China.
Half of all iPhones, wow.
Yeah. But it's not just Apple. Think about Tesla, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Google, those big companies, sometimes called the Mag 7, they all have huge stakes in China and Taiwan. Whether it's for semiconductors, those chips that power everything, or GPUs, which are essential for AI, or even just basic oligarchs for their electric vehicles, they all rely on those supply chains.
And then there was that very public back and forth between Elon Musk and Peter Navarro. Did you see that?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So Musk, he was suggesting a zero tariff-free trade zone with Europe, kind of a radical idea. And Navarro, he just shot it down, called Musk a car assembler, said he was just putting together parts made somewhere else. And of course, Musk, he's not one to back down. He fired back with that Peter Retardo comment. It was pretty entertaining, actually. But Musk's main point was that Tesla was becoming more and more vertically integrated, meaning they were making more of their own parts, less reliant on those global supply chains.
Yeah, it's a pretty good illustration of how different people, even within the business community, were viewing these tariffs. And it wasn't just Musk who was worried. Apple and NVIDIA, two of the biggest players in their respective industries, they were also reportedly getting really nervous about the potential disruptions to their supply chains.
Yeah.
I mean, Apple even asked for more time to move their production from China to India, which just shows you how massive and complex these operations are. So you put it all together, the bond market, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, they're all telling the White House the same thing. These tariffs are a bad idea.
Exactly. And the result was a pause, at least for now. But it's important to understand exactly what was paused and what's still in effect.
Right. Good point. So the reciprocal tariffs, those are the ones going back and forth between the U.S. and China, the ones that reached 125% on Chinese goods and 82% on U.S. agriculture. Those are on hold for 90 days. But the original tariffs that the U.S. had already imposed on China, those are still in place. We're talking about 54% in tariffs that were already in place before April 9th, and then they were raised to 125% on April 9th.
Yeah, so a lot of those tariffs are still very much a reality. And then you've got the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the ones outside of the USMCA agreement, and the tariffs on imported cars and steel. Those are all still active as well.
So while things have calmed down a bit, the trade tensions are definitely still there, simmering under the surface. And the source we're looking at today, it uses a pretty strong term to describe what happened on April 9th, specifically those 125% tariffs on China. They call it the start of Cold War 2.0. That's a pretty serious statement.
Yeah, it is. And it really highlights that these tariffs were specifically targeting China. Now, some might see this as a strategic move by the U.S., but our source points out that China has been playing this whole tariff game in a much more subtle way. They've been more nuanced in their approach.
And it seems like they've been anticipating this kind of situation for a while, preparing for it. What kind of advantages does China have going into this potential Cold War 2.0?
Well, there are a few things that really stand out. First, they have Russia on their side, and they've built strong partnerships with countries like Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, even Turkey. Second, their Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, has created this vast network of supply chains across 110 countries. They have a lot of influence over global trade routes now. And then, of course, there are those deep connections with Wall Street and the supply chains of Silicon Valley, which we've already talked about. And beyond all that, China has been busy building trade relationships with countries in the global south, the Gulf countries, Latin America. They're not just focused on the U.S. anymore.
It sounds like they're not as isolated as some people might think. And our source suggests they've been working to reduce their reliance on the U.S. for a while now.
Absolutely. They've been strategically de-risking their supply chains, trying to make themselves less dependent on exports to the U.S. And if you look at the data from their Belt and Road Initiative, it really tells the story.
So how much has the BRI grown? How important is it for China's overall export strategy now?
Well, it's grown a lot. Back in 2013 to 2015, exports related to the BRI, they were only about 25% of China's total exports. But by 2023, that number had jumped to around 45%. And some projections suggest it could reach 55% by 2025. That's a huge increase.
Wow. So where's all that growth coming from?
A lot of it's being driven by infrastructure projects, roads, railways, ports, all that stuff in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe. And as the BRI has grown, the percentage of exports going to non-BRI countries has shrunk.
And what about the U.S.? How much of China's exports are still going to the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. share has definitely gone down. It was about 18% back in 2015, and by 2023, it was down to around 12.75%. But here's the interesting thing. Even with all those tariffs, that number seems to be stabilizing around 13-14%. Probably because of those deeply entrenched supply chains we were talking about earlier. It's hard to just completely decouple overnight.
So it sounds like they're less reliant on the U.S., but they're not completely independent either.
Right. And China's been busy building their own financial infrastructure, too. They've got the ECNY, their digital currency, and the CIPS payment system, which is kind of like their version of SWIFT, the international payment system. And then there's the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. All of this is creating a parallel financial system, one that doesn't rely as heavily on the U.S. dollar or Western financial institutions.
So they're building their own networks, their own systems, both physically and financially. That gives them a lot of leverage, especially when you consider their control over certain key resources.
Exactly, and one of their biggest advantages is their control over rare earth minerals. Those are crucial for all sorts of high-tech industries, and China dominates the supply. And then there are active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, the key ingredients in a lot of medicines. China's a major supplier of those too. So if they wanted to, they could really squeeze the U.S. and its allies by restricting the supply of those essential materials. This whole tariff situation has really exposed a weakness in the U.S. strategy. They can't really go it alone against China.
And that's where this idea of ally shoring comes in, right? It's something that Scott Bessent has been hinting at. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Ally shoring is basically about diversifying supply chains away from China. Instead of relying so heavily on China, the U.S. would partner with other countries, friendly countries, mostly in the Indo-Pacific region, countries like India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. The idea is to create more resilient, more secure supply chains by spreading things out among a group of allies.
And India seems to be a really important player in the strategy. But the relationship between India and China is pretty complicated, right?
Yeah, it's definitely complex. India has the potential to be a major partner in ally shoring, but they also have a huge trade deficit with China. It was almost $100 billion in 2024, up from about $40 billion in 2014. And India relies on China for a lot of stuff across a lot of different sectors.
Can you give us some more details about those dependencies? It's important to understand just how reliant India is on China.
Okay, so in the pharmaceutical sector, India gets between 60% and 90% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs, from China. And in manufacturing, especially in the chemical industry, the dependence is something like 85-90%. For solar modules, over 60% of India's imports come from China. And for those battery systems that are used in electric vehicles and other things, it's over 70% for those key materials. Even in tech, India relies on China for 50-60% of its semiconductors, over 70% of its smartphones, over 60% of printed circuit boards, and over 80% of display panels. And then there are the rare earth elements, which are essential for a lot of electronics. India is indirectly reliant on China for those as well.
That's a lot of reliance across some pretty crucial industries. I know India's been trying to address this with things like those PLI schemes, but it sounds like it's a slow process.
Yeah, the PLI schemes, those are designed to encourage more manufacturing in India so they don't have to rely so much on imports. But they haven't really taken off as quickly as some people hoped. India might be a major producer of generic drugs, but they still need those APIs from China, and they're building up their solar power industry. But a lot of those Indian solar panel companies still depend on China for raw materials. And even the Indian car companies, they need things like battery chemicals and management systems from China.
So even though India has its own strengths, its supply chains are still very much intertwined with China. This whole Cold War 2.0 situation, it creates both a challenge and an opportunity for them.
Right, like take Apple, for example. They're talking about moving almost half of their iPhone production to India. That's a huge opportunity for India, especially with this whole ally shoring thing going on. But our source also warns that the U.S. might try to pressure India to cut ties with China completely, basically become a trade territory for the U.S. And that's something that India would have to be very careful about. They need to maintain their strategic autonomy, their ability to make their own decisions, both in their foreign policy and their economic policy.
That idea of India being a bridge between the U.S. and China, and maybe even between the U.S. and Russia, that's an interesting one. What do you think about that?
Well, India's in a unique position. They have good relationships with both the U.S. and China, and with Russia, too. So they could potentially play a mediating role, try to smooth things over, find some common ground. And China seems to be recognizing this, too. They've been sending some positive signals to India lately, talking about opening up trade more, even offering discounts on electronic components. So it's possible that India could become this crucial link in global supply chains, taking raw materials from China, processing them, assembling them, and then exporting finished products to the West.
So India has to walk a fine line, taking advantage of the opportunities that are out there, while protecting their own interests, their independence. And our source emphasizes the importance of learning from Vietnam. Vietnam's been really successful at building up their own manufacturing capabilities, becoming less reliant on both China and the U.S. They've really focused on indigenization, making things themselves, and vertical integration, controlling more of the production process. That seems like a good model for India to follow.
Absolutely. If India wants to be truly independent, truly resilient, they need to focus on building up their own capacity across the board, not just shifting assembly operations from one country to another.
So to sum all this up, we've seen this really rapid escalation of tariffs between the U.S. and China, a move that some people are calling the start of Cold War 2.0. But then those tariffs were suddenly paused because of all that pressure from the bond market, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. They were all worried about the potential for economic disaster. And even though those reciprocal tariffs are on hold for now, all those other tariffs are still in place. This whole situation has really highlighted just how interconnected the global economy is, how dependent everyone is on everyone else. And it's created some real challenges and opportunities for countries like India as they try to navigate this new world order.
It's a very complex landscape, that's for sure. And this whole tariff thing, it's really exposed some of those vulnerabilities, those dependencies. It's making everyone rethink those trade relationships, those alliances.
And that leads us to a final thought, something for you to ponder. If this whole tariff saga has revealed these deep, often hidden dependencies, what other vulnerabilities might be lurking out there in the global economy? And how might these events, these tensions, reshape those alliances and those trade relationships in the years to come?
Lots to think about.
Yeah, lots to think about.
All right, so let's dive right in. Remember last week when the U.S. hiked tariffs on some Indian goods all the way up to 26%. And then what, like a day or two later, bam, they drop it down to 10%. Crazy, right? This all happened right at the beginning of April, the 2nd and the 9th to be exact. And it's not just some random trade tweak. It's like the opening scene, the one that really grabs your attention in a much bigger drama that's about to unfold. The U.S. and India going head-to-head, hashing out a whole new trade agreement, a bilateral trade agreement to be precise.
Yeah, that quick tariff shift, that really jumps out at you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Speaks volumes about just how sensitive things are. High stakes right from the start. Makes you wonder, who's trying to pull ahead, gain that early advantage in these talks.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, we get it. Trying to keep up with all the twists and turns of global trade, it can feel like trying to drink from a fire hose. That's exactly why we're here, diving deep into this. Think of it as your cheat sheet, your express lane to understanding what's really going down as these two heavyweights, the U.S. and India, try to figure out a whole new way to do business with each other. So, what are the big sticking points we should be watching out for? What are the fundamental differences that are likely to create tension in these negotiations?
Well, if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, we're talking about two economic giants, each with a huge global footprint, trying to reset their whole trade relationship. Understanding where they clash, where they just can't seem to see eye to eye.
Mm.
That's not just for the trade nerds. This is crucial for anyone who wants to grasp how the whole global economy is changing.
So today, our mission, what we're really trying to do here, is to really unpack these negotiations, to lay it all out there. We're going to break down the key demands the U.S. is putting forward, what they want from India. And then we'll flip it and look at where India is probably going to dig in their heels, the points where they're likely to push back hard. We've got our research lined up, and we're going to pull out the most important insights, those aha moments, so you can really see what's on the line here. And super important point. We're not taking sides here. We're here to analyze, to understand what those fundamental disagreements are, what the strategic thinking is behind each move for both the U.S. and India. No biases, just straight analysis.
Which brings up a big question. Where do these two countries actually agree? And where are those red flags, those points where they might be headed for a major showdown? And, given all the recent tariff action, that seems like a good place to start, wouldn't you say?
Totally. The U.S. is pretty upfront about this. They see India's whole tariff system as way too protectionist. We're talking an average tariff, like the one applied to most goods, hovering around 17%. But here's where it gets juicy. They're calling out specific products where these tariffs are just sky high. Stuff you might even have in your kitchen right now. Apples, walnuts, even alcoholic beverages are getting slapped with duties anywhere from 50% to a whopping 150%. I mean, you can instantly see why American companies trying to sell these things in India would feel like they're hitting a brick wall. So it's not just about the numbers, is it? It's like a fundamental clash of economic philosophies. The U.S., they're all about open markets, free trade. India's saying, hold on, we need to protect our industries, especially while they're still growing.
And it's not just how high those tariffs are, right? It's the whole uncertainty factor that's got the U.S. worried. They bring up these import surcharges that India can just kind of spring on you, and those tariff adjustments that pop up in their yearly budget. Sometimes it feels like they come out of nowhere. Tough for businesses.
Yeah.
Especially when they're trying to plan ahead, make those long-term investments. Hard to calculate your costs when the rules keep shifting.
And of course, India has their side of the story, right? They're saying, look, we're a developing country, we've got a massive population, and a lot of our industries are still getting off the ground. We need some wiggle room, some flexibility in our policies. We've got to protect those budding industries, make sure people have jobs, especially in those rural areas where so many livelihoods depend on agriculture. And they make the point that, hey, for the most part, our tariff rates are within the bounds of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. We're playing by the rules, they argue.
But here's something interesting. They've hinted that they might be open to lowering tariffs in a few specific areas. There's been some talk about automobiles, maybe some U.S. agricultural products, a few other sectors potentially. But they've made it crystal clear. Agriculture and pharmaceuticals, those are non-starters. They're holding firm on those. National security, food security, those are their trump cards. Absolutely vital. So that gives us a pretty good idea of where those big battles are going to be fought, where the negotiations could get really intense.
Okay, so tariffs, that's one big piece of this puzzle. But the U.S. has a whole other list of grievances. It goes way beyond just taxes on imports. They're talking about what they call non-tariff barriers, or NTBs for short. Might sound a bit technical, but stick with me. These are basically all these rules, regulations, procedures that, while they're not direct taxes, they can have the same effect, making it tougher to trade. The U.S. is saying that India's NTBs are like this tangled web, super complex, often unclear, and ultimately unpredictable. It's a real headache for American businesses trying to break into the Indian market.
The thing about NTBs is they're not upfront costs like tariffs, right? It's more about the time and money you got to spend just to navigate this maze of regulations. The U.S. sources give some good examples, like customs procedures that can cause delays and drive up costs, regulations that are so confusing it takes forever to figure out what you're supposed to do, and then there are these product standards and testing mandates that India has, and they don't always match up with what's accepted internationally. So imagine you're a company, right? You spent all this time and money just to get your product tested and approved to meet India's specific standards. Even if the tariff isn't that high, it can still make the whole thing a money pit, not worth the hassle.
Exactly. And the U.S. specifically calls out sectors like pharmaceuticals, agriculture, electronics, digital services, and autos. Those are the areas where they say these NTBs are a real pain. For example, in pharmaceuticals, the price controls on things like stents, those little tubes they put in your arteries, that's been a bone of contention for a long time. And in electronics, they point to the rule that laptops have to be tested locally in India. They see that as an unnecessary barrier, something that adds costs and delays without really making the products any safer.
Yeah, those examples really bring it home, don't they? Show how those NTBs, even though they sound kind of abstract, they create real-world problems for companies trying to do business.
All right, let's dig a little deeper into a few of those sectors, starting with agriculture, shall we? That's always a touchy subject in trade talks, isn't it? The U.S. is putting the pressure on India to loosen up what they call sanitary and phytosanitary measures. That's a mouthful, but it basically boils down to rules about food safety and plant and animal health. They specifically mention things like you've got to fumigate certain agricultural imports with methyl bromide, and they've got these non-GMO certification requirements. The U.S. says those are way too strict, and they want to sell more of their dairy products, almonds, apples, you name it. Plus, they're asking for more transparency in how India manages import quotas and what they call procurement-based import suppression. What's that all about? What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, procurement-based import suppression. Think of it like this. The government puts out these tenders, these contracts for buying stuff, and they make sure those contracts go to local suppliers, even if there are cheaper or just as good options from other countries. They're basically steering all the business to Indian companies. Now, from India's perspective, agriculture is not just about economics. It's about social stability. It's about making sure people can put food on the table, especially because such a huge chunk of their population relies on farming. They argue that their minimum support price system, that's the MSP you hear about, and their food procurement programs, those are non-negotiable. They say those are the only way to guarantee food security for such a massive population and make sure their farmers aren't left out in the cold. And those non-GMO rules, the biosecurity standards, they say those are there to protect their biodiversity, which is unique to India, and their cultural sensitivities, especially when it comes to dairy and meat. So you can really see how different their priorities are, how their values clash here.
Let's move on to pharmaceuticals and medical devices. This is a big one, right? Especially when we're talking about how much healthcare costs and whether people can actually get the treatments they need. The U.S. is laying down the law on this one. They want India to stop setting price controls on medical devices. They want stronger patent protections for pharmaceuticals, longer ones too. And they want India to speed up the whole process of approving new drugs and devices, get them to market faster. Oh, and they want data exclusivity for clinical trial results. The U.S. argument is that India's current system is like a handbrake on innovation. Companies aren't going to invest in developing new treatments if they don't think they can make a decent profit, right? So the U.S. says India's policies are basically discouraging companies from bringing those cutting-edge medical advancements to India.
But India, they see it differently. They say their policies are all about making sure everyone has access to healthcare, that it's affordable. They say those price caps on essential medicines and their patent regulations are absolutely crucial. Otherwise, life-saving treatments would be out of reach for a huge chunk of their population. And they're particularly resistant to what they call TRIPS plus obligations. TRIPS, that's the basic global agreement on intellectual property, the bare minimum. TRIPS plus are these extra demands, things that go beyond those minimum standards, often pushed by developed countries like the U.S. India's worried that these additions, things like data exclusivity or extending patent terms, could mean people have to wait even longer for cheaper generic drugs. And those generics, they're the backbone of their public health care system. This really highlights that tension, doesn't it? Trying to encourage new drug development, but also making sure everyone can afford the medicines they need. It's a tough balancing act, both ethically and economically.
Let's switch gears to the tech world now. In electronics, the U.S. has some bones to pick with India. Specifically, they're not happy about India's insistence on in-country testing of electronics and these cybersecurity certifications that sometimes even require companies to hand over their source code, the secret sauce behind their software. U.S. companies often feel like these requirements are like making them jump through hoops that don't exist in most other countries. And they argue that these hoops just add costs and delays without really improving safety beyond what international standards already guarantee. They're pushing India to get rid of these import licensing requirements that seem to change at the drop of a hat, especially for critical components like the ones used in laptops and servers. The source code thing is especially thorny. It raises big concerns about intellectual property theft and potential security risks for those companies. So the U.S. is really pushing for India to just align with those globally recognized testing standards, create a level playing field for everyone.
Yeah, harmonizing those standards, that's often a big goal in trade talks. The idea is to make it easier and cheaper for companies to sell their products in different markets, reduce that friction from having to meet all these different regulations in every country.
Now let's talk about digital services, a sector that's constantly changing and full of challenges. The U.S. has a laundry list of demands here. They want India to ditch its data localization rules, those rules that say certain types of data have to be stored within India's borders. They argue for the free flow of data across borders. They also want India to scrap that 2% equalization levy. It's basically a tax on the revenue that foreign e-commerce companies make in India. And they're pushing for lighter content regulations on online platforms, maybe even changing the rules around intermediary liability. A lot on the table there.
India's view on digital services, it all comes down to data sovereignty and national security. They say, look, we need to keep certain types of data within our borders. It's crucial for national security, for making sure our regulations are actually enforced, and for protecting the privacy of our citizens. They see data localization as a way to protect themselves in this digital age, especially with all the cyber threats out there and with these big foreign tech companies having so much power. So you can see there's a fundamental difference in how each country thinks about data. The U.S., they often see data as something that should be able to flow freely around the world to help businesses grow and to drive innovation. But India is increasingly viewing data as a national resource, something that needs to be controlled and protected within their own territory.
Last but not least, let's talk about the automotive sector. U.S. car manufacturers have a pretty clear message. They want those import duties on cars and car parts to come down. They also want India to relax those local content requirements, the rules that say a certain percentage of a product has to be made in India. And they're asking for a fair shot at those electric vehicle subsidies and government contracts. Basically, they want better access to India's car market, which is growing like crazy, and they want a level playing field with Indian manufacturers and companies that meet those local content rules.
Yeah, the auto industry, it's often a window into a country's broader industrial strategy, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that balancing act between attracting foreign investment and competition, but also trying to boost their own manufacturing capabilities.
As we've been going through these sector-specific issues, two big themes keep popping up. They're kind of woven through all of this: intellectual property rights, or IPR, and that data localization issue we talked about. Let's zoom in on those for a minute. When it comes to IPR, the U.S. has been pretty vocal about what they see as flaws in India's system for protecting intellectual property. They point to the fact that it often takes forever to get patents approved in India. They say trade secrets aren't adequately protected, and they complain about the lack of data exclusivity for pharmaceutical and agricultural products. Their argument is that this whole environment makes it risky for companies to innovate and bring new technologies to India.
Yeah, the U.S. pharmaceutical and tech industries, they're particularly outspoken about this. They say that India's IP policies create so much uncertainty that it makes them think twice about investing in research, development, and launching new products in India.
But India has a different take on intellectual property. They say, hang on, our IPR laws are fully in line with the TRIPS agreement, that's the international agreement under the WTO, and they make the point that their laws are designed to benefit everyone, not just big companies. They specifically defend parts of their patent law, like Section 3 At, which is aimed at preventing what they call patent evergreening. Imagine a company tweaks a popular drug just a tiny bit, just so they can get a new patent and keep selling it exclusively for longer, keeping those cheaper generics off the market. That's exactly what India is trying to prevent. They see these measures as crucial for making sure people can afford essential medicines.
India's basic stance is, yes, innovation is important, but not at the cost of making essential goods and technologies out of reach for most people, especially in a developing country where public health is a huge concern. They also argue that some of the things the U.S. is asking for, like broader patents and longer data exclusivity, would mostly benefit those big multinational corporations, not the average person. They say it could hurt public health and limit access to technology for everyday people.
And then there's that ongoing debate over data localization. We touched on it earlier, but it's worth revisiting. The U.S. thinks India's mandates for storing certain data within its borders are anti-competitive and bad for innovation. They say it creates all these unnecessary barriers for data moving across borders, forces companies to set up expensive data storage in India, and ultimately slows down progress in fields like cloud computing and artificial intelligence, which rely on huge data sets from all over the world.
The U.S. argument is that these requirements are like putting up roadblocks for data, and those roadblocks can increase costs for businesses and make it harder to develop new technologies that depend on having access to lots of data from different places.
But India, they see data differently. They see it as a valuable national resource, And they believe that by keeping certain types of data within their borders, they can keep it safe, keep an eye on it, and make sure their citizens' digital rights and privacy are protected. They point to those directives from the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, and the new Digital Personal Data Protection Act as proof that they're serious about this. For India, giving in to U.S. pressure on data flows would be like handing over control of something incredibly valuable, and they worry it could make their citizens and their critical infrastructure more vulnerable. It's almost like a philosophical clash over how each country sees data and how it should be governed in this digital world we live in.
It's a really fundamental difference in perspective, isn't it? The U.S. is all about the free flow of information, while India is prioritizing data sovereignty and security within their own borders.
Now, a lot of what we've been discussing really brings to light a big concern in India, this sense that maybe there's a double standard going on in these negotiations. They look at the U.S. making all these demands for liberalization, opening up markets. But at the same time, the U.S. has those big farm subsidies, those Buy American rules for government contracts, and their own domestic data and cybersecurity regulations. And let's not forget that the U.S. government negotiates drug prices for their own healthcare system. So India is wondering, why are you asking us to dismantle these protections when you're not willing to give up your own?
Yeah, that perception of a double standard, that's a big factor in how India is approaching these talks. They're worried that the U.S. is mainly focused on getting a better deal for American companies without really considering India's needs as a developing country and their strategic goals. For India, it boils down to sovereignty, to the right, to make their own decisions about their economy and social policies. They're really concerned about giving up too much on things like food security, affordable medicine, and control over their data, especially if they think the agreement isn't fair and could hurt their economy and their people in the long run.
So with all this on the table, what are the chances of the U.S. and India actually reaching a trade agreement?
Well, it's pretty clear that it's going to be a long and bumpy road. India will probably need to show that they're willing to make things more transparent and streamline their regulations, but they're not going to budge on what they see as their core national interests. And as our sources point out, any agreement that works, it's got to be a two-way street. It can't just be about the U.S. getting better access to the Indian market. It's got to address the concerns of both sides. And what makes this whole thing even more interesting is the big picture, the geopolitical landscape. The sources talk about this idea of a new Cold War brewing, this time between the U.S. and China. And in that kind of world, India is in a unique position. They could become a major player, maybe even a bridge between East and West, instead of being forced to pick sides. The question is, can India use their position to get a good deal in these trade talks while also navigating those bigger global shifts?
It's like we're seeing two separate supply chains, two different tech worlds emerging. And India, with where they're located geographically, their massive economy and their relationships with different countries, they've got to walk a tightrope. They want a strong economic partnership with the U.S., but they can't afford to wreck their relationship with China, their neighbor and a huge trading partner. Finding that balance, that's going to be crucial.
That leads to this really fascinating idea, this notion that India, maybe together with Russia and the GCC countries, could form this third pole in global politics, advocating for what they call multipolarity in bipolarity. It's like they're saying, we don't want a world dominated by just the U.S. or China. There's room for other powerful players with their own interests and perspectives. It really shows how complex the world is right now and how countries are trying to figure out their place in it.
So let's take a minute to recap what we've covered today. Those U.S.-India trade talks, they've got some major obstacles in their path. We talked about the clashes over tariffs, those non-tariff barriers that the U.S. sees as roadblocks, and the specific demands in those key sectors: agriculture, pharmaceuticals, electronics, digital services, and autos. And underneath those specific issues, we've got these fundamental differences in how they approach intellectual property rights and data localization. Those issues get right to the heart of national sovereignty and economic policy, don't they?
And for you, the listener, this isn't just some theoretical debate happening in some conference room somewhere. What happens in these negotiations, it can affect all of us. It can impact global supply chains, the prices we pay for everyday products, access to medicine, and even the balance of power in the world. These discussions can have ripple effects that we all might feel, even if we don't see them directly.
And on that note, here's something to chew on, something to think about as we wrap up. The world seems to be splitting into these different camps, these competing alliances. So how can a country like India balance their own interests, the things that are vital to them, with the benefits of being part of the global trade system and cooperating with other countries? Is it even possible to be a bridge between these global rivals without eventually being forced to choose a side? It's a tough question, and the answer will not only determine what happens with this U.S.-India trade deal, but it could also play a big role in shaping the future of global politics and economics.
Food for thought.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
See you then.